What would you do if your in-laws demanded your husband get a DNA test on your child, right in front of dozens of family members, while your kid was standing right there, hearing every single word? I lived through that moment. Why did they do it? Let me tell you the whole story. Before I get into it, thank you for taking the time to listen to what I'm sharing today. Hello, everyone. I'm Claire Miller, 38 years old, and I work in financial management here in Fresno, California. My husband is Carson. He's 2 years older than me. The story I'm sharing today happened during Christmas of 2023. Christmas is supposed to be a time for families to come together and share warm moments. But for our little family, that Christmas turned into a nightmare we'll never forget. It was the deep wounds Dylan had to carry, the tears of humiliation I fought to hold back all night long. And for Carson, it was the ultimate disappointment in the people he used to call Dad, Mom, and his big brother. That afternoon, around 5:30, Carson drove Dylan and me from Sacramento to Bakersfield, where his parents lived. It was close to a 3-hour drive, cutting through the endless cotton and almond fields of the Central Valley. Dylan sat in the back seat, nonstop asking about the gifts Grandpa and Grandma might give him. And the whole way there, he sang along to Christmas songs on the radio, his eyes bright and full of excitement. Watching him in the rearview mirror, my heart felt warm and heavy at the same time, weighed down by a vague worry I couldn't put a name to. While Dylan was buzzing with excitement, I felt that familiar heaviness pressing on my chest. Every visit to Carson's parents' house meant I had to prepare myself mentally, not because they were openly rude to me, but because of the way they looked at me, the way they compared Dylan to Tyler, Brent's son. Those endless comparisons had become a permanent fixture at every family gathering. My father-in-law, Gerald Miller, and my mother-in-law, Loretta Miller, raised Carson on a farm in the agricultural heart of Bakersfield, California. It was a 3-generation family tied to the land of the Central Valley, with almond orchards stretching as far as the eye could see, and that great Western American pride in bloodline and tradition. When you understand that, you understand why having a grandson who didn't look like the family was such a big deal to them. When you're the wife in a family like that, you learn something early on. You're always the outsider, no matter how hard you try. You cook, you smile, you stay quiet when you have to, and they still look at you like you're a threat to their bloodline. Carson knew that better than anyone, and he sat quietly behind the wheel, one hand on the steering wheel, one hand on mine, like he was saying he was right there. I squeezed his hand and didn't say anything else. If only I had known that would be the last time we'd ever walk into that house as a family, I would have asked Carson to turn the car around right then and there. The moment Carson parked and we walked into the living room, that familiar atmosphere of a Miller family gathering wrapped around me. The room was packed, voices and laughter filling every corner. I walked Dylan in, keeping a smile on my face even though I was already feeling uneasy inside. I just finished saying hello to a few relatives near the door when Carson turned away to find a spot for Dylan's little backpack. I stood there for a second, about to follow him, when those familiar whispers started up behind me. Dale's voice, the voice of my father-in-law's cousin, came through pretty clearly, even though he was trying to keep it low as he leaned toward his wife, Rhonda.
Dylan doesn't look anything like Carson.
The moment those words hit me, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that, but every single time it still cut just as deeply as the first. Right after Dale said that, Rhonda replied with a mysterious tone.
Exactly. What if Dylan isn't actually Carson's kid?
Dale quickly cut in, his voice nervous as he glanced over toward us.
Keep it down. Carson might hear you.
Even with Dale's warning, Rhonda didn't stop. She actually raised her voice a little, like she wanted to make sure everyone nearby could hear.
So what? It's the truth. Look at Tyler, Brent's son. That boy is the spitting image of Brent when he was little, like 2 drops of water.
Hearing those cruel words, I stood there frozen. My throat tightened, not because I wanted to cry, but because I was working so hard not to say something I'd regret. I was an outsider in this family. I'd known that from the very first day Carson brought me home to meet them. But hearing people openly question whether your son is your husband's child, right in the same room where your son is standing, somewhere behind you, that's a completely different kind of pain. Right when I didn't know what to do next, Carson appeared from the hallway. One look at my face and he knew something had just happened. He walked straight up to Dale and Rhonda, stood right in front of them, and said through gritted teeth,
"Watch what you say. Don't think I heard you."
Dale's face went pale instantly. Rhonda opened her mouth like she was about to fire back, but Dale quickly put his hand on her shoulder and shook his head to signal her to stop. Right as the tension hit its peak, my father-in-law appeared from the kitchen doorway. He looked around with a suspicious expression and called out in the voice of a man used to giving orders.
"What's going on in here?"
Dale swallowed hard and quickly answered,
Nothing at all. We were just saying hello to each other.
My father-in-law slowly nodded, his eyes scanning the room. When he turned to look at our family, there wasn't a single bit of warmth on his face. No smile, no word of welcome for his son and grandson upon their return home. Instead, he spoke coldly, like he was talking to hired help.
"Since you're here, come help me and your mother get the party ready. Brent's family is out back helping with the grill."
I looked at Carson. I watched his jaw tighten and then release. He didn't say a word. He just turned to me, his eyes saying everything, then gave a small nod toward the kitchen. I took Dylan's hand and followed Carson into the kitchen. Inside, my mother-in-law was busy with a large tray of food. She looked up at us, gave a quick nod, hello, then pointed at a few other trays and said,
"Take these out to the living room for me."
Not a single question about how we were doing, not a single hug for the grandson she hadn't seen in months. I bent down and whispered to Dylan, "Help me carry this out, okay?" Dylan nodded, wrapped both arms around a tray of pastries, and walked out like the good kid he was. Watching my little boy work so hard to please adults who couldn't even be bothered to look at him, I knew right then this was only the beginning of a very rough Christmas night. Around 6:30 that evening, the dinner table in the living room was fully set. The smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and all the classic Christmas dishes filled the whole space. Carson led Dylan and me toward the seats near his parents, where, by tradition, their own children always sat closest. The moment Carson put his hand on the back of a chair, my mother-in-law suddenly held up her hand to stop him and said in a completely casual tone, like she was directing guests to their seats,
"Carson, why don't you and your family sit at the end of the table and help me look after the guests down that way?"
The moment she said that, a wave of sadness hit me. Not because I was being pushed to the end of the table, but because I saw Carson stand completely still for 1 second too long. I knew what that silence meant to him. Dylan looked up at me with a confused expression, tugged gently on my hand, and asked quietly,
"How come we don't get to sit near Grandpa and Grandma, Mom?"
I bent down, smoothed Dylan's hair, and said gently, "Grandpa and Grandma just want us to help take care of everyone, that's all, sweetie." Dylan nodded and didn't ask anything else, but I caught his eyes drifting toward the head of the table, where Tyler was being pulled into Grandma's lap, his hair being stroked with so much tenderness. That look on Dylan's face hurt me more than anything my mother-in-law could have said. We quietly moved to the far end of the table. When the seats down there felt unfamiliar and cold, like we truly were just guests at a family gathering. From where I sat, I could see the whole table. My in-laws sat at the head, with Brent and his family arranged right next to them, while we'd been pushed all the way to the farthest corner. Throughout the meal, I watched my in-laws shower Tyler with constant attention. My mother-in-law piled food onto his plate and patted his head with that soft, loving look in her eyes. Now my father-in-law told jokes that had Tyler giggling. Meanwhile, Dylan sat quietly beside me, occasionally glancing toward his grandparents with that look in his eyes, that longing to be noticed. I reached under the table and took Dylan's hand, gave it a gentle squeeze, and leaned in to whisper, "Do you want some more mashed potatoes?" Not because I was asking about potatoes, but because I needed Dylan to know I was right there and I saw him. Carson sat beside me, quiet. He ate slowly, head and head slightly down. I knew he was holding it together. I put my hand over his under the table and squeezed it the same way he always did with me. He looked at me and smiled, just barely, like he was saying he was okay. Right in that moment, I realized something I'd been trying not to admit for years. I wasn't trying to earn this family's acceptance anymore. I was sitting here counting down the minutes until we could leave. Midway through the dinner, when the mood had loosened up from the wine and laughter, the first fight broke out of nowhere. Rhonda, somewhere around her third or fourth glass of wine, had rosy cheeks and a tongue that was starting to slip. From her seat in the middle of the table, she stood up unsteadily, raised her glass toward the head of the table where my in-laws were sitting, and spoke up in a voice louder than usual.
Looking at Tyler just reminds me of Brent when he was little. Tyler is exactly like Brent, not one bit different.
My mother-in-law smiled with pride, nodded in agreement, and replied with an excited tone.
That's right. You can tell just by looking at him that he's Brent's son.
That seemed to give Rhonda a boost. She turned around and looked toward the far end of the table where we were sitting. Her eyes scanned over Dylan, then came back to me with an expression like she was working out a difficult puzzle. And then she kept going in an even louder voice.
But Dylan, Carson's son, doesn't look anything like Carson. I keep looking and I can't find a single thing in common.
After those words, the room went completely silent. Even the sound of forks and knives on plates stopped. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. Then I looked over at Dylan. My son was sitting right beside me, frozen stiff. He was staring down at his plate, his little hands clasped tight together under the table. I pulled him close, wrapped one arm around his shoulder, and felt Dylan's small body go rigid as a bowstring. I don't remember what I tried to say to him in that moment. I only remember staring straight ahead, working to keep my face neutral while something inside me was breaking apart piece by piece. A few relatives sitting near Rhonda quickly grabbed her arm and gestured for her to sit back down. Right as the tension was about to snap, Floyd, my father-in-law's younger brother, jumped to his feet. With a forced smile, he raised his glass high and said in a deliberately cheerful voice,
"Come on, everyone. Let's raise our glasses. Merry Christmas."
Everyone seemed to snap out of a nightmare and quickly lifted their glasses. The dinner went on, but I wasn't at that dinner anymore. I sat there rubbing Dylan's back, watching him eat in silence with his head down, and I started to understand that even if nobody said another word that night, the damage was already done, and no clinking of glasses was going to undo that. Right then, I caught a glimpse of my in-laws' faces at the head of the table, and they weren't looking toward Dylan with the eyes of people who wanted to protect their grandchild. They were looking toward the end of the table with irritation, as if my son's very existence was the problem. Around 8 o'clock that evening, after the last plate was cleared from the table, my father-in-law stood up and clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. He smiled broadly and announced with an excited voice,
Time to give the kids their gifts.
The kids cheered and erupted across the room. They crowded around the beautifully decorated Christmas tree in the corner. Dylan stood up too, his eyes lighting up with hope. I looked at my son and felt a small flicker of warmth slip into my chest. At least this, I thought, at least the gift-giving part won't be a problem. One by one, gifts were called out and handed over. The other grandkids received toys, books, and new clothes. My in-laws called each child's name with warmth, adding a kind word or a little message of love. When it was Tyler's turn, my father-in-law carried out an enormous gift box, carefully wrapped in shiny gold paper with a red bow. He set it down in front of Tyler with a proud look on his face and said loud enough for the whole room to hear,
This one's for my beloved grandson.
When a brand new iPad Pro appeared inside, the whole room gasped. My mother-in-law stroked Tyler's head and said in a tender voice,
We got you this so you can learn and grow your talents.
And then the gift-giving was over. The room gradually settled back down as people returned to their seats. Every child had a gift in their arms, except for one, my son. Dylan was still standing there, looking around with confused eyes. He waited a few more seconds, hoping someone would call his name, but nothing happened. Finally, Dylan came back to where I was. He grabbed my sleeve, his voice trembling and almost breaking.
Mom, how come Grandpa and Grandma didn't give me a gift? Do they hate me?
I pulled Dylan into my lap, held him tight, and said in a voice I was fighting to keep steady, "Maybe they just forgot. I'm sure they'll give you something in a little while." Dylan looked up at me, tears running down his cheeks. And then he asked me something I will never forget for the rest of my life, his voice breaking between words.
Is it because I don't look like Dad that Grandpa and Grandma hate me?
My mind was spinning while my body stood completely still. Dylan had heard. Dylan had understood. All the whispers, all the looks, all the treatment throughout the night, and now being left out of the gift-giving entirely. A 10-year-old boy had gathered all those broken pieces and figured it out on his own. I held him tighter, buried my face in Dylan's hair, and fought with everything I had not to break down right then and there. Because if I cried, Dylan would know his answer was right. Carson was standing beside us. I didn't look up, but I felt the shift in him, like the air just before a storm. I knew Carson was going to say something, and I knew I couldn't stop him. And honestly, I didn't want to. Carson stood up from his chair at the end of the table. I watched him, holding Dylan tighter, my heart pounding out of rhythm. He walked toward my in-laws at the head of the table. When he got close, he slammed his wine glass down on the table, sending a sharp crack through the room that made everyone flinch. Every conversation stopped. Standing tall, Carson looked my in-laws straight in the eyes and asked in a cold, steady voice,
Why? Why didn't Dylan get a gift?
My mother-in-law raised her head, her face showing clear contempt. She snapped back with a sharp, dismissive tone.
Dylan embarrassed this whole family and now he wants a gift?
Hearing those words, I was trembling and feeling a rage rising in my chest that I had no right to show because Dylan was still in my arms. My child embarrassed the whole family, my 10-year-old son, the kid who sat quietly through the entire dinner, polite to every single adult, asking for nothing except a little bit of love from his grandparents. Carson pressed on, his voice shaking.
What exactly did Dylan do to embarrass anyone?
My father-in-law cut in, pushed up from his chair, pointed straight at Carson's face, and shouted,
You're still asking? Didn't you hear what Rhonda said? That boy doesn't look one bit like you.
Right as the tension became suffocating, Floyd quickly jumped up from his seat. With a worried look on his face, he held both hands out, gesturing for everyone to calm down, and said in a peacemaking tone,
Come on, everyone, it's Christmas. Let's not do this.
Carson immediately turned and looked at Floyd. With a bitter edge in his voice, he shot back,
That's right, it's Christmas. And my parents gave gifts to every single grandkid but left my son out. That's just ridiculous.
The room went so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. Dylan, in my arms, had stopped crying. He was looking toward his dad with swollen eyes, but the panic was gone. There was something in the eyes of a 10-year-old boy watching his dad stand up for him, something I don't have the words to describe. My mother-in-law stood up and walked toward Carson. Her voice was ice cold when she said,
Carson, it's been 10 years. Listen to me. You need to take Dylan to get a DNA test. This whole family is exhausted by the fact that Dylan doesn't look anything like you.
What my mother-in-law said hit me like a bucket of ice water over my head. My feelings went completely numb. I swallowed hard, fighting to hold myself together, because right then I realized those words weren't just an attack on Carson. They were a direct attack on me, on my faithfulness, on my dignity as their son's wife. And they said it in front of Dylan. Before that wave of rage could even settle, Brent stood up from his seat right next to my in-laws, and he walked toward Carson with a smug look on his face, stopped just a few steps away and said in a tone dripping with fake sympathy,
Carson, stop being so stubborn. Just look. Dylan doesn't look anything like you. from the features on his face to everything else about him. Even the hair color doesn't match.
The second Brent finished talking, Carson screamed with everything he had.
Shut your mouth unless you want to regret it.
At the sound of Carson's shout, Dylan flinched and curled tighter into my arms. I held him closer, one hand covering his ear, even though I knew it was too late. A few other kids in the room burst into tears. Brent stepped back, his face draining white. The whole room sank into a heavy silence. After a few suffocating seconds, Carson turned and looked his parents straight in the eyes. His voice was terrifyingly calm when he said,
All right, I'll do what you're asking. I'll take Dylan to get a DNA test.
My mother-in-law started to smile with satisfaction, but that smile vanished fast when Carson kept talking.
But I have something to say. I think Brent, I, and Dad should all get DNA tested too, because looking closely, we don't have a single thing in common.
What my husband said in that moment made my father-in-law furious. So furious, his face went deep red. He slammed his hand down on the table, sending glasses rattling, and screamed.
That's enough. Stop it right now.
But Carson didn't stop. In a voice cold as ice, he kept going.
Take a hard look, Dad. Mom betrayed you and had both Brent and me. Can't you see that? Neither Brent nor I looks anything like you. Maybe this whole family should get DNA tested. What do you think about that?
My father-in-law collapsed back into his chair as a puppet with its strings cut. His right hand went up to his chest, his face gone pale, breathing hard. My mother-in-law screamed in a voice that was nearly out of control.
That's enough, Carson, that's enough.
But Carson looked straight into her eyes, feeling a strange calmness wash over him. In a loud, clear voice so the entire room could hear, he said,
Congratulations, Mom and Dad. From now on, you only have one son, Brent, and one grandchild, Tyler. You and me, we're done.
My mother-in-law shot to her feet, eyes wide and staring at Carson in disbelief, and demanded loudly,
What do you mean? You dare say that to your own mother?
Carson took a long, slow breath. Then he spoke with a voice that was clear and steady.
Claire and I were together for 5 years before we got married. I trust my wife, and anyone who disrespects my wife or my son, I won't forgive.
He paused for a moment, swept his eyes across the entire room, then continued,
And take a good look, Mom. Neither Brent nor I looks anything like Dad. You're accusing my wife of cheating, but I think you're actually talking about yourself.
The room practically exploded after that. I sat there holding Dylan in my arms, listening to the whispers erupting from every direction, and I felt something strange. Not relief, not satisfied, just a deep, real sadness. Sadness that everything had to come to this. Sadness that a 10-year-old boy had to sit in his mother's arms and watch all of this happen. Then Carson turned and walked back toward us. He bent down, looked at Dylan, and said gently,
Let's go home, buddy.
Dylan looked at Carson and nodded. Then he turned and looked at me. I smiled at him, stood up, took Dylan's hand in one hand and Carson's hand in the other. We walked out of that house in complete silence. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody tried to stop us. When we got to the car, Carson buckled Dylan into the back seat. The crying had stopped, but his eyes were still red. Carson got in the driver's seat, and I got in the passenger seat. He started the engine and drove away from that familiar road, one we'd probably never come back to. For the first 15 minutes, nobody said a word, just the sound of the engine and the wind coming through the windows. Outside, the vast fields of Bakersfield were swallowed up in the darkness of Christmas night. And after we'd been driving for a while, I quietly turned to look at Carson. His jaw was still tight, both hands gripping the wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead. I knew he was processing everything that had just happened in his own way, in silence. I put my hand over his on the steering wheel and said softly, "Thank you." Carson didn't respond right away. He just flipped his hand over and laced his fingers through mine. Then he let out a long breath and said quietly,
You and Dylan are everything to me.
From the back seat, Dylan spoke up.
Dad,
Carson glanced at him in the rearview mirror and asked,
"Yeah, buddy."
Dylan said, in the voice of a 10-year-old boy trying to make sense of a world too complicated for his age.
I love you, Dad. I love you, Mom.
I turned my face toward the window, not because I didn't want to look at him, but because I didn't want Dylan to see me cry. In that moment, I realized something. Family isn't the wooden farmhouse in Bakersfield. It's not the long dinner table with 33 relatives. It's not the gifts wrapped in shiny gold paper. Family is in this car. The man had his fingers laced through mine. The little boy in the back seat is looking out the window, counting stars. And that's all I needed. That night, after Carson and Dylan had fallen sound asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The tea in my hands had gone cold, but I still didn't feel like getting up. The house in Sacramento was dark and still, only the streetlight cutting through the window and casting faint streaks across the wall. I wasn't thinking about what my in-laws had done. I was thinking about why it took me so many years to accept that they were never going to change. And from the very first day Carson brought me to Bakersfield to meet them, I could already feel my mother-in-law's guardedness. Not rude, not cruel, just a very subtle coldness. The way she'd look me up and down and then turn to ask Carson about work instead of talking to me. The way every time I said something, she'd wait a beat before responding, like she was deciding whether what I said was worth a reply. I tried. I tried for so many years. I brought baked goods to every visit. I asked about my father-in-law's health and helped my mother-in-law clean up the kitchen after every gathering. And every single time I drove back to Sacramento, feeling like I'd just run a marathon nobody told me I was signed up for. When Dylan was born with dark hair and brown eyes just like mine, I knew it was going to be a problem for them. But I never thought they'd let it become something public, something spoken out loud in front of other people. In front of my son. Why, there are things a woman can endure for the sake of her marriage, but there are things no mother can ever endure. And that night in Bakersfield, my in-laws crossed that line. In that moment, a quiet feeling settled over me that our lives were about to turn in a completely different direction, and there was no road leading back. 2 days after Christmas, Carson called Patrick, his closest friend from college, and the lawyer he trusted most. When Patrick picked up, Carson got straight to it.
"I need your help with something important."
That afternoon, while Carson sat in Patrick's office with a box of documents in his hands, I stayed home with Dylan. We made Christmas gingerbread cookies, listened to music, and I did my best to create some sense of normal for him, while everything around us was shifting. Carson came home that evening and walked me through everything. The $300,000 loan from 2018, when my in-laws had made a bad real estate investment and nearly lost their house. Desperate, that they'd come to Carson, and Carson, out of love for his family, had agreed to help on the condition that his name be added to the property deed. 5 years had passed, and they never followed through on that promise. I sat and listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked, "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" Carson looked at me and nodded. I nodded back. Nothing else needed to be said. 10 days later, when Patrick sent the legal notice to my in-laws, Carson's phone went absolutely wild. 93 missed calls within 3 hours, 57 voicemails. Carson didn't answer a single one. One evening, Clint, their close neighbor, called to let them know my in-laws had shown up at our house in Sacramento multiple times, pounding on the door and screaming in the yard, but they didn't know we weren't there anymore. Starting early on the morning of December 26th, or just one day after Christmas, Carson and I had decided to leave Sacramento. The house in Fresno that Carson had bought back in August 2023 as an investment suddenly became the perfect place to land. We only took what we needed most: clothes, important documents, and a few keepsakes Dylan refused to leave behind. The rest would be moved later. Dylan didn't fully understand everything, but when we got to Fresno and he saw the new house with the big backyard, he ran outside, or circled the yard a few times, then came back in and asked me,
Are we really gonna live here, Mom?
I told him, for real. And Dylan smiled. the kind of smile I hadn't seen in a long time. 2 months later, Carson received $450,000 from the sale of the Bakersfield house. I remember him standing there staring at his phone screen for a long time without saying anything. Then he set the phone down on the table and went outside to sit alone in the yard. I didn't follow him right away. I gave him that space. Because I knew, for Carson, that wasn't money. That was the period at the end of 40 years of being a son, a younger brother, and trying to be loved in a way they never truly gave. 2 years have passed since that Christmas night. Fresno is really and truly home now. Dylan is 12, taller, more confident, and he laughs more than at any point I've ever seen in his life. He has new friends, a soccer team he loves, and a little desk corner in his room with dozens of books he organized himself. Carson and I have cut off all contact with my in-laws and Brent. No calls, no texts, no social media. Sometimes I wonder how they're doing after losing the house. And then I think about Dylan's face that Christmas night, his red eyes and that question, is it because I don't look like Dad that Grandpa and Grandma hate me? And every question I had about them disappears. For me, the hardest part wasn't cutting them off. The hardest part was looking back and realizing I'd spent so long trying with people who never truly wanted me there. But that's also what I learned. You can't control how other people treat you. And you can only control whether you keep letting them. Through my story, I want to say something to the women out there who are enduring discrimination from their in-laws, to the mothers watching their children be treated like outsiders in their own father's family, that you don't have to stay silent forever. And protecting your child is not a betrayal of your husband's family. It's what you have to do. Family isn't just blood. Family is where you're loved, without having to prove you deserve it. I lost the relationship with my in-laws and my brother-in-law, but I kept something more important than all of it. I kept my son growing up in a home where he knew he was loved unconditionally. And to me, that's everything. That's where my story ends. But before I go, I want to ask you something. If you were in my situation, if your own in-laws publicly questioned your child's paternity right in the middle of a family dinner, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. I really want to know what you think, and if this story moved you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to follow more stories like this. Thank you for listening.